Right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back promptly. So we're now moving on to the stages subsequent to what we talked about in the morning, which was largely about progression through high school and into colleges and universities. We've got two speakers again this afternoon, and again I'll introduce them both so that it's a smooth transition between them. First of all, Dr. Gitit Kadar-Satat, who's going to talk about the processes of retention within higher education. Gitit did a PhD on an educational topic to do with things that happen outside the classroom, indeed outside the school. It was absolutely marvellous PhD, if I may say so, as one of the examiners. So I very much look forward to what Gitit has to say here. Then second paper is then looking beyond that again into what happens to graduates when they enter the labour market. And that is from Professor Marita Jakob of the University of Cologne, whose expertise is precisely in this area. And one of the very marvellous things about the very interdisciplinary and very international education and social stratification strand in AQMeN, which organised the conference today, is the bringing together of people who are expert in school education, in higher education, and in the case of Marita, in the progression beyond higher education into the labour market. So, first of all, Gitit.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and listening to us. Earlier, we heard about social inequalities in school subject choice and entry, and what I'd like to do now is focus on inequalities in higher education retention in Scotland, because it is very challenging to enter higher education, but it could also be challenging to attain a degree, to complete and attain a degree. And I would like to share with you some emerging findings from our research, but before I do that, let me just say a few words about the policy background of our research. This research is very closely linked to the Widening Participation National Programme, which we heard about today as well. And this is a priority for the Scottish Government and for higher education institutions since the late 1990s. As we heard today, the widening participation policies and interventions are designed to provide all young people in Scotland, regardless of their socioeconomic background, with an equal opportunity to do two things. First, to enter a higher education institution, but also to get the support they need in order to succeed in their studies, so in this case, to attain a university or higher education degree. So there are really two aspects here, access and retention. And with that in mind, we wanted to know, or we still want to know, a number of things, and these are the research questions that we pose. First, are students in low socioeconomic status group more at risk than those in high socioeconomic status group to drop out from higher education before attaining a degree? And we measure socioeconomic status with three different measures: parental occupation, which we call social class, parental education, and also the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. And we also want to know whether there is a variation in the dropout rate of students from high and low socioeconomic groups by the type of higher education institution that they attend, or by the subject that they choose to study, the field of study. In order to answer these research questions, we use data from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, aka HESA, and we use data for all Scottish higher education institutions. However, our population is restricted to the academic year 2012-13, and we have information about students in all years of study. It's also restricted to Scottish domiciled students who are full-time first-degree students who are aged 21 or younger on entry to higher education. And the working sample that we used for today's presentation, so where we presented findings on first-year students who enter in or after August 2011. So basically straight from high school to university, young students. Okay, before we look at the characteristics of those who drop out, let's have a quick look at the socioeconomic backgrounds of those who enter university. This bar chart shows very clearly a gap in the percentage of young people from high and low socioeconomic status groups who enter higher education. So from left to right, we can see that students are more likely to be from a high social class than from a low social class. They are more likely to have at least one parent with higher education qualification, and they are also more likely to be from the 20% least deprived areas in Scotland than from the 20% most deprived areas in Scotland. Perhaps this is not a shock to you. You're already aware of this statistic, but it's useful to bear that in mind later on when I discuss retention. What's perhaps even more important or equally important is the connection between entrants' socioeconomic status and their prior attainment as we measure by tariff score. So this bar chart shows that among those who enter with low tariff scores, there is an overrepresentation of students from a low social class, while these students are underrepresented among those with the highest tariff scores. And the trend is opposite for students from high social class who are overrepresented among those with high tariff scores and underrepresented among those with low tariff scores. The pattern by parental education is similar and again indicates that students who have parents with higher education qualifications are more likely to enter with a high tariff scores than students who don't have parents with higher education qualifications. And also Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation shows a similar pattern. Students are more likely to enter higher education with a high tariff score if they live in the 20% least deprived areas. Okay, it's time for some results, some findings. First thing first, the overall percent of first-year dropout is 4.7%, and remember, these are young entrants, and this is important. I am now going to show you some socioeconomic trends in dropout from higher education institutions in Scotland. This bar chart shows us the percentage point difference in first-year students' probability to drop out by socioeconomic status. Now, before I address the bar chart, I would like to say that we find no indication that students' dropout rates vary by social class. However, this bar chart shows that students are more likely to drop out if they have parents with no higher education qualifications or if they live in more deprived areas. So, for example, look at the very top bar, the light blue bar. This shows that the probability to drop out is 0.8 percentage point higher for students with parents who have no higher education qualifications compared to students who have parents with higher education qualifications. Now, this number is very, very low, perhaps, but remember that the overall dropout rates are indeed low. Having said that, it's very serious. It could be very serious to drop out of higher education for the individual and also for institutions. So we don't take this low percentage lightly. It's very important. But I would like to refer you to the second bar, the dark blue bar that says 0.4. This is the probability to drop out for students with parents with no higher education qualifications, but if we also consider the tariff scores. So dropout rate, the probability to dropout rates for these students reduces dramatically and in fact becomes insignificant when you also take into account their prior attainment. And This indicates the tariff scores explain about 50% of the gap in dropout rates between students with or without parents with higher education qualifications. And the second part of these bar charts show that the probability of dropping out is 1.7 percentage point higher for students in the 20% most deprived areas in comparison to those in the 20% less deprived areas. And again, this gap is reduced to 1 percentage point when tariff scores are considered and taken into account, again, to demonstrate the importance of prior attainments for students' retention. Now, this table shows that dropout rates vary to some extent by the different types of higher education institutions, and dropout rates seem to be the lowest in ancient universities and the highest in post-92 universities. And what about the connection between dropout rate, socioeconomic status, and the type of institutions that students attend? Well, first of all, our models did not detect any socioeconomic gap in the dropout rate of students in post-92 universities. But what we do see here is that in ancient universities, the probability to drop out is 1.5 percentage point higher for students from a low social class than for students from a high social class. And again, this is reduced and becomes insignificant when we account for prior attainment as measured by tariff score. And in the pre-92 universities, students are more likely to drop out if they come from the 20% most deprived areas. Again, this gap is somewhat reduced, but not completely disappears when tariff scores are considered. There is also some variation in dropout rates by fields of study, as can be seen from this table. And we just wanted to show two examples, STEM subjects and humanities and social and arts. This is just two examples. We will have a report that discuss other subjects, fields of study. So let's focus on STEM subjects. In STEM subjects, the probability to drop out is higher for students in deprived areas and those with parents who don't have higher education qualifications. Again, I'm repeating the importance of prior attainment, which accounts for some, not all, but some of the variation in socioeconomic dropout rate from STEM subjects. In the humanities and arts, the probability to drop out is 2.7 percentage point higher for students with parents who have no higher education qualifications. This is interesting because in this case, only a very small portion of the dropout gap is explained by prior attainment. In fact, there is really no reduction when we consider prior attainment in these fields of study. Okay, let's summarize. The overall trends or patterns of first-year students' retention in Scottish higher education institutions is as follows. Students are more at risk to drop out if they have parents with no higher education qualifications or if they live in the most deprived areas. We didn't find any significant variation by social class, generally speaking. Students who enter higher education with low tariff scores are also more at risk of dropping out than students who enter with a high tariff score. Up to 50% of the socioeconomic gap in dropout rate is explained by attainment at entry to higher education. With regards to retention by the type of higher education institution that young people go to, there is socioeconomic gap in dropout rate in ancient and pre-92 universities, but we didn't find any in post-92 universities. And what we also find that there is a socioeconomic gap in dropout rate from all fields of study for different degrees, except the social sciences. We still need to explore that further. Okay, but there are some limitations that I would like you to be aware of, so our research lacks limitations. Firstly, I would like to say that we think that we underestimate student dropout rate. In fact, we know that because we don't include mature students, part-time students, or articulating students, for example. We don't have that, so this is why we also report a lower dropout rate. There is also some issues with the measures that we use. A social class and parental education, for example, this is a measure that the students themselves report, and we have a large proportion of unknown. Students who didn't know, who didn't or were not sure about what box to tick when they were asked about their their parents' education or occupation. And also, the number of cases is relatively small, so this has implications for statistical analysis and may indicate that we don't have enough statistical power to detect significant effects, while there may be a statistical effect. So this is just something to consider. Thank you very much.